When scholars chronicle 19th-century Berlin, their narratives typically emphasize surface-level transformations, the majestic boulevards, the imposing imperial structures, the swift metamorphosis from Prussian seat of power to industrial metropolis. Yet the genuine story, the one that scarcely penetrated public consciousness, the one that remains concealed in obscure archival margins, even today, originated beneath the streets. It commenced with a straightforward municipal directive. Engineers received instructions to prepare subterranean terrain throughout the expanding city for new construction, water distribution systems, and civic infrastructure. The objective was utilitarian: excavate foundations, evaluate soil composition, and establish whether the ground could sustain Berlin's ambitious modernization agenda. However, the instant laborers began penetrating the earth beneath the historic city quarters, something unanticipated occurred. They breached strata that had remained undisturbed for centuries. Beneath the structural foundations, deeper than any documented construction depth, the teams discovered conduits and vaulted spaces that corresponded to no recorded system. Their design was peculiar, their purpose was mystifying, and the infrastructure bore no resemblance to anything in the engineering literature of that period. It didn't even resemble conventional European heating arrangements as commonly comprehended. This wasn't referenced in public accounts regarding Berlin's expansion. It didn't feature in the newspapers celebrating Prussian industrial triumph. Yet in the internal documentation from that era, a particular phrase surfaces repeatedly: pre-existing thermal infrastructure, unexpected sophistication, origin undetermined. The sanctioned narrative would subsequently reduce all of this to abandoned medieval cellars, antiquated brewery passages, or simply forgotten utility work. Nothing remarkable, nothing meriting discussion. But the survey photographs from that time, the ones processed in dimly lit government facilities while Berlin celebrated its progress, reveal something different. They reveal laborers positioned beside ceramic-lined conduits cut with precision far superior to any kiln of that era should permit. Passages fitted together so seamlessly that even in the inadequate lighting of 19th-century photography, no separations are detectable. Distribution systems that bear no resemblance to any recognized heating methodology, but something older, more advanced, more intentional. And the deeper they excavated, the more the strata ceased resembling forgotten cellars as we understand them, and increasingly resembled a climate regulation system that had been interred, concealed, and deliberately erased from memory. Initially, the excavation crews attempted to categorize everything in the most straightforward manner possible: ancient furnace chambers, abandoned hypercaust remnants, natural subterranean springs. However, as documentation accumulated and additional conduits were exposed, the contradictions multiplied. Why were some of the underground passages constructed with thermal tolerances far surpassing anything required for basic heating? Why were certain ceramic components shaped in standardized configurations as if industrially manufactured rather than individually crafted? Why did some distribution networks penetrate into areas far beyond the perimeter of any documented structure? And the question that troubled even the most seasoned engineers: why were these systems so comprehensive? Berlin during the 19th century was industrializing rapidly. Yet the thermal infrastructure beneath portions of the historic city appeared engineered for a heating capacity no contemporary engineer could rationalize. Survey teams quietly acknowledged among themselves that the magnitude and sophistication didn't align with any recognized historical epoch. And although none of them employed terminology like lost technology, they were recognizing something equally disturbing. Someone had constructed a citywide heating system previously. Not rudimentary fireplaces, not primitive heating devices, something else entirely. As the documentation proliferated, so did the silence. Reports became more abbreviated. Descriptions became ambiguous. Photographs ceased displaying the most comprehensive views of the discoveries, and then the excavation zones were partially refilled during the late 1800s, covered where necessary for new construction, and much of what was exposed was returned to obscurity. Only fragments persist. Notes, a handful of photographs, and the quiet testimonies of archivists who examined the files before some of them vanished. Yet even from what survives, a pattern materializes. Infrastructure too sophisticated for any recognized historical period. Engineering too exact for the accepted chronology. Heating methodologies that appear inherited rather than invented. Technology that seems to originate from an entirely different construction era. If you're finding this investigation compelling, consider subscribing. These mysteries don't conform neatly to official history, and exposing them requires investigating where conventional narratives refuse to venture. When the excavation crews advanced past the initial recognizable strata beneath the expanding districts, the expectations were straightforward. They anticipated discovering basement levels, perhaps some medieval cellars and scattered remnants from earlier construction phases. Nothing unusual, nothing extraordinary. But within weeks that assumption disintegrated because instead of a tidy sequence of building periods, the teams exposed a stratification of thermal infrastructure that didn't behave the way ordinary heating systems are supposed to behave. The first anomaly was integration. Each stratum, recognized basement, unrecognized subbasement, and whatever existed beneath, seemed to adhere to identical heat distribution logic, identical conduit patterns, identical engineering principles. Different eras shouldn't accomplish that. Different builders, different objectives, different centuries. They don't construct in perfect integration with systems that originated generations earlier. Yet beneath Berlin they did. Conduits from one period connected directly to conduits buried meters below them. Heat distribution networks shared identical trajectories, even when separated by what appeared to be centuries. Thermal regulators maintained identical orientations even when divided by indefinite time periods. It was as if every group that ever constructed on this ground was connecting to an original infrastructure, one that no longer existed in any engineering documentation. As the laborers excavated deeper, the strata became increasingly anomalous. Beneath the anticipated foundations and cellars, they began encountering infrastructure that resembled nothing like medieval heating. Substantially larger conduits, substantially tighter tolerances, patterns that seemed too mathematically exact for anything in Berlin's documented chronology. Some chambers appeared almost over-engineered, vaulted spaces with perfect heat circulation, crafted with precision that didn't correspond to the crude construction methodologies of any recognized period. And then arrived the discovery that perplexed even the most conservative members of the engineering crews: advanced ceramic systems, conduit walls lined with materials that displayed no indications of deterioration, ceramic surfaces glazed with techniques that 19th century manufacturers couldn't reproduce, lower passages with thermal properties that only modern material science can explain. Yet there exists no historical documentation of Berlin ever possessing such advanced ceramic production, no record showing manufacturing capable of creating these heat-resistant materials, nothing that explains why extensive sections of the deepest infrastructure appear to have been constructed with technology far beyond anything medieval Europe is credited with. Survey photographs captured during Berlin's expansion demonstrate this clearly. Laborers positioned beside ceramic-lined conduits, so flawlessly preserved that the materials appear almost new. Joints so precisely fitted that even today, ceramic engineers study the archival images in disbelief. Thermal systems that resemble modern radiant heating far more than anything 19th century Europe supposedly possessed. But the most unsettling detail was not what appeared in the photographs. It was what didn't appear in the archives. The official accounts written in the years following the expansion barely reference these features. Some drawings omit the deepest thermal systems entirely. Certain infrastructure is summarized with vague terminology like earlier construction or utility remnants, even though the photographs demonstrate it was far more complex than that. The silence is difficult to overlook because If these deeper discoveries genuinely belong to recognized historical periods, why weren't they described comprehensively? Why weren't the unusual heating methodologies documented thoroughly? Why were the photographs dispersed across municipal archives instead of compiled into a singular engineering report? Even some of the conduit construction raised concerns: surfaces too smooth, measurements too uniform, thermal properties too consistent, marks that appear less like hand construction and more like industrial fabrication. Fabrication that, according to the conventional chronology, didn't exist when those systems were supposedly constructed. What the excavation crews exposed were systems that didn't correspond to medieval construction, didn't correspond to recognized European engineering, and didn't even correspond to one another in any conventional sense. Instead, they constituted a peculiar technological vocabulary, one that seemed to originate from a unified source, yet somehow predated everything in the historical documentation. The initial revelation came with the distribution chambers themselves. These weren't crude furnace chambers or simple heating pits. They were geometrically perfect spaces, chambers shaped with exact dimensions, vaulted ceilings that maintained their curvature flawlessly, and ceramic systems arranged with coherence, almost like the remnants of a master climate control facility that no longer exists in any archive. Some chambers were sealed completely, packed with fill so dense that laborers thought they had encountered bedrock, but once opened, they revealed interiors that appeared untouched since the day they were closed. Smooth walls, fitted ceramic, and heating infrastructure that raised more questions than answers. And then came the feature that still perplexes researchers today: the thermal regulation mechanisms. Officially, they were later classified as old furnace equipment or abandoned heating apparatus, but nothing about them conforms to typical medieval or early modern heating design. These were too sophisticated, too precisely calibrated, and too perfectly integrated with the conduit networks, as if they were designed to maintain temperature regulation across enormous distances. Some regulators were substantial enough to occupy entire chambers. Others contained internal components that appeared designed for automatic heat adjustment. Laborers from the 1800s described them in private correspondence as engineered thermostats. Not simple dampers, but control mechanisms with a climate regulation function, though no one could establish what technology powered them. Another anomaly appeared in the heat source locations themselves. These were not merely chambers with fireplaces or coal storage. Many were positioned at depths that made no practical sense for fuel delivery, integrated into the infrastructure in ways that suggested the heat originated from below, not from combustion chambers filled from above. It created an uncomfortable possibility. The structures above ground may not simply rest on foundations with basement heating. They may sit on something substantially larger, a geothermal or chemical heat generation system whose technology was never recorded, never taught, and never explained in the official history of Berlin. The deeper the laborers excavated, the stranger the findings became. Conduit segments appeared with perfectly uniform ceramic linings. Some surfaces were glazed smooth, almost frictionless. Others displayed precision-formed joints so clean that modern heating engineers still debate what manufacturing process could have produced them. But the discovery that caused the most confusion was the material composition of certain components. Some pieces were fabricated from ceramic compounds that chemists of the 1800s couldn't identify. Others displayed crystalline structures in the glazing that only form under kiln conditions far beyond any documented furnace of that era. The official explanation offered subsequently imported materials, unusual clay deposits, but that doesn't explain why these materials appear in engineered systems, not raw form, shaped, processed, manufactured into precise ricine infrastructure. That kind of ceramic engineering requires temperatures and techniques far beyond 19th century capability, far beyond anything recorded in European industrial history. Soon after these discoveries, something unusual began occurring. Chambers were refilled. Conduits were blocked. Deep sections of the thermal system were severed from further investigation. Some of this was officially labeled as safety concerns, necessary to support new construction above. But the decisions about which chambers to fill first, and which areas to bury permanently, raised quiet questions among observers, because the spaces that were closed immediately were invariably the ones that contained the most anomalous infrastructure. The precision regulators, the unknown ceramic compounds, the integrated distribution systems, the engineered chambers that seemed to extend far beyond the excavation zone. These connecting networks were perhaps the most mysterious find of all. They weren't random passages. They were part of an organized pattern, a grid of thermal conduits that appeared less like heating and more like citywide climate control, aligned, standardized, planned as if they once served every major district of Berlin through an underground system we no longer recognize. And yet, almost as soon as they were exposed, many were sealed again, their entrances blocked, their purpose unexplored, their existence quietly removed from subsequent city plans. When you study the final phases of Berlin's 19th century expansion, something becomes impossible to ignore. The investigation didn't conclude, it was terminated. Not completed, not finalized, terminated. The deeper the excavation crews advanced, the more the tone of their documentation changed. Early entries were confident, almost routine, but by the end, the language becomes cautious, vague, and strangely incomplete, as if someone else suddenly controlled what could be documented. And this is where the final mystery begins. Because the last chambers they opened beneath Berlin weren't ordinary, they weren't medieval, they weren't early modern, they weren't even identifiable as any recognized type of heating system. They were something else entirely. Multiple reports, the few that survived, described infrastructure that suddenly shifted from the familiar to the unexplainable. Ceramic systems with thermal properties so advanced you couldn't replicate them with period technology. Distribution networks designed with precision that 19th century Europe was never supposed to possess. Chambers constructed to regulate climate across areas far larger than anything documented in the city above, and conduits that extended beyond the excavation zone, disappearing into darkness beneath modern Berlin. But here's the part that always gets buried. The most advanced systems were the ones that were reinterred the fastest. Laborers described filling entire thermal chambers back in, sealing access points, packing earth into spaces that had just been uncovered. It wasn't gradual, it was immediate. The official explanation, structural concerns, construction deadlines, municipal priorities. But if it was only about practical matters, why were the most sophisticated, most perfectly preserved heating systems the ones sealed first? And why were the obviously damaged medieval sections left exposed for documentation? It doesn't make sense unless those deeper discoveries posed a different kind of threat. Not a physical one, because if the infrastructure beneath Berlin genuinely showed climate control technology far beyond 19th century capability, and if some of those systems didn't correspond to any recognized civilization at all, then the entire accepted narrative of European technological development begins to collapse. Imagine what it would mean if a modern city was constructed on top of something far older, something sophisticated, something engineered for citywide climate control, something we didn't build. Imagine what it means if the heating systems weren't medieval innovations, but medieval attempts to repurpose or conceal technology they couldn't explain. And perhaps that is why the discoveries during Berlin's expansion were quietly reinterred, not to protect the sites, but to protect the narrative. The surviving photographs tell their own story. Laborers standing next to ceramic systems that appear almost industrial, distribution networks that resemble modern radiant heating, infrastructure too integrated for its supposed age. These aren't the kinds of discoveries historians prefer to explain. They're the kinds they prefer not to discuss at all. And that brings us to the final question, a question no archive, no textbook, no official publication has ever answered fully. Why was the most advanced evidence, the most sophisticated infrastructure, the most anomalous thermal system sealed away again? Because when you step back, the pattern becomes clear. The precision ceramic work was buried. The thermal regulators were buried. The distribution networks were buried. The climate control chambers were buried. The unknown materials were buried. And even portions of the photographic record vanished, almost as if the expansion had accidentally revealed a chapter of history that wasn't supposed to surface. A chapter older than medieval Berlin, older than recorded construction methodologies, older than the narrative we were given, and for one brief moment in the 1800s, the earth opened just enough to show it. But instead of studying it, they closed it again, sealed it, filled it, forgot it, or pretended to. Because if Berlin stands on top of a heating system constructed by a civilization we no longer acknowledge, then the real question is not what was discovered during the expansion, it's what else lies beneath the cities of the world. What other capitals, what other infrastructure, what other thermal systems were quietly reinterred long before anyone thought to question the official story? Tartaria's underground heating networks weren't just forgotten infrastructure from an earlier period. They were a glimpse, a brief, accidental glimpse into a version of history we were never meant to see. And now that glimpse is your clue, your map, your invitation to question everything we think we know about how our world was really heated. Because if this is what survived under one city, imagine what still radiates warmth in the darkness beneath the rest. Thanks for watching. And if you found this interesting, well, there are a lot more cities with stories like this. Maybe I'll see you in the next one.